So starting with, my involvement with Smartwool, a company that was based up in Steamboat Springs, where I lived for 20 years, is now in Denver as part of VF Corporation's portfolio. I would say that we started off with a very fundamental commitment to natural fiber, which is a massive environmental commitment. Even though performance attributes of natural fibers in some cases are eclipsed by synthetics or man-made fibers, we were highly committed to merino wool and really only using kind of petroleum-based fiber where we needed to for abrasion resistance or for elasticity. And so Smartwool was one of the pioneers. Again, we're going back 20 years of the natural fiber movement, and not only in natural fiber itself, but how that fiber was processed and treated. One of the things we all need to be very aware of is that even though something like cotton could be a natural fiber, it can be a very, very heavy impact on the environment. The water usage for growing cotton is unbelievable. The process of treating and dyeing cottons can be very chemically intensive, and so it's not enough to be committed to a fiber that itself is easier on the environment, biodegradable and so on, but the process for treating and commercializing that fiber, I think, is important, and it's been changed really significantly in the last decade or so, with huge commitments from companies like not only the Patagonias of the world, which we all have top of mind, but believe it or not, brands like Nike, who's the largest consumer of organic cotton in the world. So from the Smartwool piece, after we sold that company to Timberland and I retired for a little while, I came out and joined a friend who bought another sock brand called Coe. It was based in Boulder. I worked as a consultant on and off for that brand. It also was a wool-based brand, but it was focused on not using chlorine in the process of treating the fiber. So the way that Smartwool and really the entire industry made wool not shrink and not pill so much when it was put in the washer and the dryer was treating the fiber with a chlorine treatment. Chlorine can be impactful on the environment. So Coe was based on a plasma treatment for wool. It was probably a little ahead of its time, but we were very committed to not only the natural fiber, but how that fiber itself was processed. From there, I moved on to another Colorado-based brand called Chaco. Used to be down in Paonia, Colorado. It was acquired by Wolverine, my current employer, about 10, 11 years ago or so. And Chaco takes a different approach to environmentalism. And that is something that I think a lot of consumers don't focus on, but that I would encourage everybody to focus on. And that is product durability and repairability or re-commerce. Any of you who may be so fortunate as to have Chaco sandals probably realize they are relatively bulletproof, and they're not a product that is disposable. The antithesis of Zara or H&M, it's not fast fashion, it never was in fashion, and it lasts forever. So the product durability and the fact that the product is repairable, so if it does get worn down in most areas, it can be sent back to us, and we can re-web it and resole it and put it right back into use, and then recycle the components that get pulled off. So when we talk about environmental impact, one of the biggest things we can do, and we're seeing a number of brands, including Patagonia and even Nordstrom now getting on, kind of bringing it around full circle and trying to reuse or repair a product. Chaco was one of the leaders in that area with just making a super bulletproof product that lasted for decades, not just for weeks. We also made other commitments at Chaco that were environmental in nature, commitments to plant-based materials. There are EVA foams that are inevitable in closed-toe footwear for the most part, and there are a number of companies out there, one of which we partnered with called Bloom, that uses algae in producing its EVA foam. So They can dial up the algae content and dial it down, but Bloom product can contain anywhere from 10% to 30% algae as a component in that EVA foam, which is not perfect, but it's a move in the right direction. There are other plant-based material providers out there, one of which we're in negotiations with right now, so I can't share the name, but they have developed the science that allows them to replace everything from leather to textiles to some elements of rubber with 100% plant-based materials. As I say, they're in the startup stage. They've gotten some huge commitments of late from some very big global brands to further their research and development, which started with the US government, the Department of Navy. But that sort of plant-based material selection, I think, is increasingly important in the outdoor space. They're also through the industry. The Outdoor Industry Association was one of the drivers of something referred to as the Higg Index, H-I-G-G, and that is a measure of the relative environmental friendliness of fabrics and materials that are used in apparel for the most part. OIA was one of the drivers of that. It's been in development for over a decade, and the Higg Index is now ready and in use, has been for a number of years, and it allows various manufacturers to measure the relative environmental friendliness of not only their finished product, but the process of producing that product. So those are a few of the things that through the industry I've had the good fortune of being involved in. Again, from the individual action of riding a bus or riding a bicycle or buying a carbon offset, all the way up through commitments to natural fibers in lieu of petroleum-based product, and further down to how those materials are actually produced and turned into a finished good.
Thanks, Chip. That was super helpful to get an idea of the array of approaches you've been a part of in terms of approaching environmental stewardship. Continuing on with that train of thought, can you share with us what the biggest success has been for you as being a part of an environmental stewardship initiative in the outdoor consumer products industry?
Most of those things have been, with a couple of exceptions, have been successful to one degree or another. In terms of overall impact, I think probably the move toward natural fibers that was really spearheaded by Smartwool early on is probably the most scalable as it started to retrain outdoor enthusiasts, action sports enthusiasts, snow sports enthusiasts to remember natural fibers as opposed to man-made or petroleum-based product. They had been around in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and even before. That was really the only option. When technology developed things like nylon and other forms of plastic and polypropylene, polyurethane that they said were higher performance, the industry sort of shifted that way, and it was really a handful of companies that were committed to bringing natural fibers back into focus, and I think Smartwool was one of the earlier ones. So that's probably one of the largest. I would say, Natalie, the most successful, in my view, has been Chaco because it's been so sustainable. They've been producing that Z sandal for 30 years, 31 years this year. Of course, there have been modest design changes, but generally speaking, a large chunk of polyurethane with a rubber outsole and some sort of webbing on top that lasts forever and doesn't just get thrown out every year, I think has had a huge impact. The brand repairs somewhere in the range of 30 to 40,000 pairs of sandals every year, in addition to selling new product into the market that is built to last a long time. So the fact that you can keep it out of the landfill is huge. I can't remember the exact number. Just in the past couple of years, Chaco rolled out some flip-flops, and I can't recall the statistic I heard of the number of pairs of flip-flops that are thrown away every year globally, but it's something in the range of like 30 or 40 million pairs that are just relatively disposable. And I'm sure all you get it. You go on spring break, you buy a pair of Javianas or native flips for, 15 bucks. If you happen to leave them at the beach, or, one of them blows out, or you just don't like the color at the end of the trip, you pitch it, 15 bucks, not a big deal. But the number of pairs that are in landfills or floating around in oceans is just staggering. So I think making a more durable, repairable, long-lasting product is probably a great first start. Now, that product itself is not biodegradable. It's not made out of the most environmentally friendly materials, so we have to acknowledge that. But the fact that it lasts forever, I think, is a good step, toward stewardship.
Awesome. Yeah, I just bought a new pair of Chacos after having my other pair for 13 years. The new ones I have the cloud technology, so they're super comfortable. I love them. Okay, so we just got a question from the audience about Chaco, thinking more from a business perspective of sustainability. The question is, Chaco sandals last forever, and creating a product that customers only have to buy once isn't the most profitable move. What do conversations around this topic look like inside the company? Was there ever pushback?
Yeah, great question. We talked about it all the time, really pretty tongue-in-cheek. Yeah, built-in, planned obsolescence is probably a good thing. I think Apple probably leads the league in thinking that way, as all of us ran out and dropped, hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on the latest, iPhone because it has 3 cameras, not 2. You guys are probably not old enough to remember the time that phones didn't have cameras. So the fact that you have 3 now is apparently revolutionary. The conversations internally were, yes, we have a product that lasts forever. That's the good news and the bad news. It's the reality of the brand. The brand is committed to that. Its consumers expect and demand it. We're also very performance focused, so making product that is incredibly durable, which is how that brand built its reputation, is just kind of a core tenet of the brand. And so even though we probably could have a larger business if we made product that just fell apart a little more quickly, that's not a serious conversation that has ever been had at the brand. I happen to know the founder of the Chaco brand because it was in Paonia when I was in Steamboat running Smartwool. So I've known Mark forever. When it shifted over to Wolverine, I happened to join Wolverine shortly thereafter, and they had really no idea what they bought. Unfortunately, Chaco had come on hard times for a variety of reasons, and Wolverine picked it up and tucked it up underneath our Merrill hiking shoe brand, and really didn't have it having a life of its own. So when I joined the company, I pulled it out and kind of rebuilt the team, and off we went. We will never, ever go to making less durable product, even though we're part of a large public company and return to shareholders and stakeholders is important. Brand, kind of brand leadership and brand integrity is more important. So yeah, it's an issue for Chaco, but it's one that'll never change.
Awesome. That's really insightful. When I was ordering my new Chacos, I was reading comments, people discussing, whether or not quality had changed as the company has grown. So it's reassuring to hear from you that the mission still stands for long-term use and ownership. So similarly, have you ever been part of an initiative that has failed or not met expectations?
Yes, absolutely. I mentioned earlier on that I worked for a small time with a friend, actually a British friend, who had acquired the Teco brand. It was also based in Boulder, and this guy lived in Edinburgh, Scotland, and was commuting once a month to try and run this brand he had just purchased, and it was just wearing him down. So he asked me if I would help him out a little bit, and I did. That got me into Boulder a couple days a week from Steamboat for about a year. And that product was a good product. And as I say, it was merino wool based, using a non-chlorine shrink resistance treatment that should have been a bigger deal in the industry than it was. But it just didn't really catch on. I don't know if we were ahead of our time, or we didn't have the resources to really tell the story properly, or importantly, the product wasn't quite up to the performance standards of the competition. The competition was largely, at that time, Smartwool. And that's an important thing I'll get to later on in our chat. The outdoor industry is full of highly educated and focused consumers, and performance is the number one attribute that they're looking for. So despite how environmentally friendly or aesthetically pleasing or well-priced your product may be, if it doesn't perform in the outdoor space, consumers will call BS on it immediately and you're out. And so the Teco brand, I don't know if it's still around. I got uninvolved with it back in 2009 or so, and I've kind of lost touch, so I'm not sure, but that was one that didn't really work. More recently, a disappointing one, I mentioned earlier that it's critical that we understand how raw materials are processed and treated to come into our finished product. And one of the areas that is a bit harsh on the environment, and that everything that each of you is wearing at the moment likely suffers from, is the process of dyeing. So to take natural fibers or what they call graze goods, so before they're colored, and make them that lovely navy or red or yellow or purple or whatever you're after, the fibers have to be dyed. And the dyeing process is fairly chemically intensive, and as importantly, it is energy intensive and water intensive. There is a new dyeing process that has been developed that is called e-dye, and it uses about 90% less water and much lighter on the chemical load and much lower on the energy consumption scale than traditional nylon or polypropylene dyeing. So the Chaco brand committed to the supplier behind e-dye and pledged most of the webbing for the Z Sandal franchise. And bear in mind that brand is putting more than 1 million pairs a year of the Z Sandal into the market. So it's quite a large consumer of this nylon webbing. To have all of that dyed using the e-dye process was a pretty big deal. We were really excited about it. The science was proven. The group behind it seemed to have the resources that were required. And unfortunately, when we got into it, it just wasn't scalable as we had hoped it would be. There were huge delays in getting the work done, which led to huge delays in the production of our finished goods. I guess the good news is, well, it depends on if you view it as good news, but the vast majority, 95% of Chaco's sandals have been pulled out of China and actually moved to the Dominican Republic and to the US in our own Chaco facility. And that speeds up the lead time, and it cuts down on the freight that is involved in getting product from the factory to the market, because we're largely a domestic brand. But the e-dye team just couldn't keep up, and it led to a bunch of delays in deliveries, which means we have empty shelves at retail, and that just won't go. So unfortunately, although the idea was great, and we thought we had done a good job of it, and we made a fairly decent amount of noise in our marketing and social activities about it, it just didn't come forward, and we had to pull back. So there's an instance where the idea was good, and it just wasn't kind of ready for the speed of business.
Okay, thank you. Now that you've talked about some of your successes and situations in which they did not meet your expectations, you might call them failures. Can you give us an idea of overarching what works and what does not work in terms of implementing environmental stewardship initiatives in the outdoor consumer products industry?
Yeah, let's start with kind of debunking, I think, one of the common concerns that we had a decade ago, and maybe even more than a decade ago, and that was cost. There was a huge amount of consternation within the outdoor industry about whether consumers were willing to pay more for organic product or for kind of natural fiber product because it was relatively cheap before oil prices got high. They're back down, but at a time we're now at, I don't know, $40 a barrel for oil. It used to be over 100, so things were quite expensive. But prior to that big spike, in oil prices, synthetic product was super cheap. And so there's lots of hand wringing around cost and would the consumer pay? I think that question's been answered, and we really don't talk about it much anymore. Cost is not the issue. Consumers are willing to pay more for a product that performs well, that is more eco-friendly, that comes from a brand that stands for something, especially if what it stands for aligns with what the consumer's views are. And so cost is relatively not the issue anymore. It really comes down to performance, which is the driving issue in the outdoor space. And when I say outdoor, I'm including action sports and snow sports as well. Performance is a huge issue. So the product needs to be relatively easy care. That was the breakthrough for Smartwool. Nobody had previously had, wool product you could throw in the dryer and it wouldn't come out, sized for your doll. So easy care is critical. Reliability is super important. It's got to be visually acceptable. I mean, there are folks out there who like things that are ugly. The brand that I'm the president of now, Chaco Footwear, although in the US is largely a work boot brand, outside of the US, where about 70% of our business is, it's a lifestyle brand. And it makes product, especially for the Latin American market, that looks like the huge chunky sneakers you guys see from Fila and from Balenciaga and that sort of thing. These gigantic, huge moon boots that are, for me, just kind of interesting, but we're selling a hell of a lot of them in Chile and Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil. So visually acceptable. You can't compromise the aesthetics of the product just because it's more environmentally friendly. Despite the pickup truck that Elon Musk and his friends at Tesla have shown, that is, I don't know what it is, a Blade Runner or Darth Vader vehicle or something. Generally speaking, the product needs to be, aesthetically acceptable. And then I think importantly, and I touched on it in the e-dye example, if the product isn't scalable, you're going to fail. And that goes for whether it's a finished product or a raw material. If it's just not scalable, if consumers get on something and they drive, demand for it, and you can't keep up, they're going to move to the next thing. They're not going to wait around. And if that happens and you lose that momentum, then you're probably on the road to, to the death of the thing. So I would say that, what works are those things that are true. As I mentioned before, outdoor consumers are super informed, and if you're faking it, you'll get caught, and then you're dead. That's it. Word spreads really quickly that you're a pretender and not really into what you're doing. You're just greenwashing and trying to make a buck, and the outdoor industry in particular doesn't want to hear that, so they'll go. So it's got to be authentic. It's got to be scalable. It's got to be focused on performance and kind of available, relevant to the market at the time from an aesthetic standpoint.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing those takeaways. Another question from the audience is, do you think there is a solution to the overwhelming amount of waste produced by fast fashion brands?
Ooh.
Big question.
I think the answer that I'm going to give is yes, but it depends on one thing. Those brands, and we're talking about some of the biggest brands in the world, Zara, H&M, multi-billion-dollar companies that have been enormously successful globally. The thing that can bring about a change in behavior is the consumer. So the gentleman who owns the Zara empire in Spain, I assure you, will not keep doing what they're doing if consumers weren't buying it. And so it comes really down to consumer behavior. If consumers vote with their wallets against fast fashion and in favor of more durable product, and I think the current consumer, the mindset of sort of, let's just say mid-20s and younger, my boys are are in their kind of mid to upper 20s now, and maybe they're on the far edge of that, but they're very much into, you know, having fewer things that may be higher quality and are more versatile, as opposed to having, you know, a closet full of stuff that, like I mentioned, the flip-flops earlier, if you have only 10 or 12 or $15 invested in them, they're disposable. So I think that the short answer is, when the consumer says they're tired of fast fashion, that'll change. So long as people are still packing those stores and using their, you know, their money to support that initiative, it'll carry on. I mean, business just adapts to what the consumer is demanding at the time, and consumer demand will need to change.
Great. That leads us really nicely into my next question, thinking about, you know, how we as lead students can make meaningful value when it comes to environmental stewardship. So can you share with us, what is the next frontier in impactful environmental stewardship, and how can lead students contribute meaningful value to the work that needs to be done now?
Yeah, in terms of the next frontier for me, Natalie, I think I'd say two things, and I've already beat the drum on one of them. I think the biggest impact that is out there to be had environmentally is in materials, and that's material science. It is selection of material, how things are treated. So kind of what is it and how is it made? And there's a huge amount of work that is going on, led by a lot of outdoor companies. North Face is behind a bunch of stuff. Patagonia, of course, is the poster child for this kind of thing. But there are a number of brands. Vormi, there's some really good brands that are focused on materials, much like Smartwool was in the early day around socks. There's an awful lot of environmentally unfriendly processes and materials that are prevalent in the outdoor industry. Part of that is because they provide the protection that is needed against rain and wind, and they can be lightweight and warm. They can dry quickly. There's lots of scientific reasons and performance reasons why those materials exist. But it's changing, and it's changing fairly quickly. Where you know, waterproofing treatments, DWRs, are changing from a chemical base to biodegradable processes. Materials themselves are focused on biodegradability. One of the brands that the company I work for owns is Saucony running shoes, and Saucony ran a small ad during on the streaming edition of the Super Bowl, that they're developing a fully biodegradable shoe. Running shoes are one of the things that fill the landfills more than anything, because the EVA foam packs out. Any of you who are runners, and I am not, but I'm told that people will get a few hundred miles on a pair of running shoes, and then they're packed out and they have to get pitched. And then they just go buy the very same thing because they know it fits. And it's shocking. A really committed runner, and I know Boulder's full of them, you know, they can go through 4, 5, 6 pair of running shoes a year, just because they're packing out, and they need the cushion and support. So focused on biodegradability for those foams, for the rubbers, for the upper material. I think materials is going to be the place that has the biggest impact on the environment, both in terms of end use, but also how it's processed and what kind of impact it has. The other we're starting to see crop up in a pretty big way, and it's an area that's called re-commerce. And Patagonia has a program called Worn Wear, I think. Nordstrom partnered with the very same company. It used to be called Yurtle. It's now called something else, who runs these re-commerce sites for Patagonia, for Nordstrom, for Eileen Fisher. We've had extensive conversations with them about re-commerce for Chaco and some of our other brands. And so I think the whole concept of repairing and reusing something is going to be interesting. There's a brand in the space called On Running. It's a Swiss brand that's come out with a kind of revolutionary, at least in terms of its aesthetics, it's a pretty revolutionary running shoe. It's hugely popular, and interestingly, largely by people who wear it as for casual wear, like athleisure. It's not so much on the hardcore running side, but On just came out with an apparel line that is announced, I think last week, that is subscription based. So if you buy some of their running apparel at the end of your use of it, you send it back and they'll give you a replacement garment. I think it's free. I think they just give you a replacement garment, and they then recycle the old one into insulation or something else they can use elsewhere in their process. So we're going to start to see this kind of re-commerce theme coming up, in a really huge way. And I think that'll be interesting, and it'll be telling. It's the antithesis of fast fashion. Just putting something back into let someone else use it. It's the kind of fancy version of Goodwill, I guess. In terms of lead students and what you can do to support, I come back to the comment that I made about fast fashion, and it comes down to the consumer. If people feel strongly about something and consumers line up to support it or to vote against it with their pocketbook, that's what is going to, turn the tide. So companies that are investing in research and development, and a lot of these material developments and process developments take years and literally millions of dollars to develop, they need to have profitability in other parts of their business to be able to sustain that level of investment. So if there's a brand out there or a company or a material supplier that we think is doing a good job, we need to support them with our dollars so that they can create profit to reinvest in the effort, and we need to support them with advocacy and encouragement. It's crazy to say, but even just comments on Instagram or other social channels that say, way to go, this is great, I love this brand because it stands for X or because it does Y. Those things, they appear literally in board of directors decks. I kid you not. I'm with our board at the end of October, and I'll be presenting. And when we get clips like that off of Instagram or Twitter, they find their way into the PowerPoint deck that gets shown to the board, just to encourage the board to approve the budgets to continue to invest in those things. Because at least in my case, we are a public company, shareholder return is a big deal. And if we're saying, hey, we need to spend $500,000 on R&D for, new foams or new upper materials, and some of the board members are thinking, wait a minute, that's $500,000 we could declare in dividends if we weren't spending it on this R&D. They need encouragement to reinvest. Obviously, board members, generally speaking, are smart. They get it. They understand the mission. But having a little bit of social encouragement helps as well. So I would say, vote with your wallet and vote with your voice.
Wonderful. Thank you. Those are good action items for us to take away for sure. Another question from the audience is, there has been a lot of conversation on materiality about circularity. Have you looked at that with the brands that you have worked with, and what are the additional challenges that have made this change too difficult to implement?
So let me make sure I understand the question. We're talking about materiality and circularity?
Yeah, I'm not sure who asked the question, if they want to jump in to clarify, or if Sarah, if you better understand the question than I do.
Can I put you on the spot, Chris?
Okay. Yeah, so I think you actually answered this question pretty well in your last answer also, in talking about some of the different ways that some of the different ways brands are looking at kind of closing the loop with just about closing the loop with different material use so that it's not going to the landfill. And so that's, basically kind of what we're talking about as far as circularity, about kind of bringing that back around the loop to bringing that back around to be able to use again. But I know that that's a real challenge with many consumer goods companies. And so I think that you gave a couple of great examples of how companies are working through some of those challenges. So I just didn't, so you might not have anything else specific, but if you do have anything from the brands you've worked with or that you are working with now, that would be great too.
Yeah,
Thank
so I mean, I would refer you, Chris, to a book that was written, golly, it's got to be 15 years ago. If I remember correctly, it was called Cradle to Cradle, and it's really about starting with product design. So it's not just the material selection. How is the product designed? So in order to have a product with true circularity, and believe me, this is a real conversation in companies all over the place, and people are making really good progress on it. Things need to be able to be taken apart as easily as they can be put together in order for a product to either be reusable at the component form or recyclable. I mean, there are simple examples. If I understand it correctly, for example, I think that the coffee cups that you get from Starbucks or others, although they appear to be paper, they're not recyclable because they're coated with some lining that makes them not recyclable. Okay, so you'd think it would be, and certainly everyone in my family just throws them in the bin, and I'm like fishing them out dutifully to make sure I'm separating this stuff. At some point, you got to train the kids instead of just covering for them. But the product needs to be able to be taken apart. So you start with product design. And then you look at the materials themselves and how can they be repurposed when they've exceeded their useful life or met their useful life, and how easy is it? So if we go back, you'll hear me reference Patagonia all the time. In fact, here I am flying the flag today only because our air conditioning is hyperactive, and I think we prepaid the bill. It's like 43 degrees in my office. I got to go outside to warm up. But in any event, Patagonia had a program back in the day where you could bring your Capilene underwear. Capilene is a fancy brand name for plastic. You could bring your Capilene long underwear back to a Patagonia store, and they would recycle it for you. This was probably a decade or 15 years ago. Really what happened is, because it's a polyester fiber, they would take the base layer that you took back to their store in Boulder, for example, and they would ship it dutifully to their headquarters in Ventura, California, and that burned a bunch of gas to get it on a truck from Boulder to Ventura. Then they would put it on a ship, and it would go back across the ocean to Taiwan. So there's a little diesel fuel that's burned getting back to Taiwan, where they would break the product down into kind of granular polyester form. So that takes some chemicals and some grinding and some energy, and then they would reconstitute it as a monofilament, so it comes out as usable polyester, and then they could make it into some other thing. Well, that's really cool, except if you think about the impact of all those steps to make that happen, you're way behind. I mean, you think you're doing a good thing and you just completely kind of screwed it up. So, what product gets used and how it gets repurposed and how much circularity you can really have is a function of a lot of things. I mentioned that a lot of companies are doing good work right now. One of those is in the area of companies like Icebreaker and Smartwool and others, North Face, that are producing a bunch of wool product, have figured out that wool also serves as a really good insulator. It's not just a next to skin type fiber. So they can take old wool product and kind of literally grind it up and use it as the insulation in a Vastra puffy coat. And so that's happening a lot. It gets used in home insulation. So tons of wool products are being turned into insulation for your home. You no longer have to use fiberglass. There is wool insulation. The good news is also wool doesn't burn. If you don't have a flame held to it, you remove the flame, it extinguishes immediately. So in terms of house fires and that sort of thing, there's lots of circularity that is going on in the area. But as I say, it starts with design. There are certain footwear companies, Allen Edmonds back in the day, it was a dress shoe brand that you guys may have never heard of. You'd pay back in the day, you'd pay a few $100 for a pair of Allen Edmonds dress shoes, and then you could send them back to the company in Minnesota when you wore the heel down or wore a hole in the sole, and they would resole them for you, much like Chaco does. Chaco can put an outsole on your Chacos. They can't do it across all their product. only the Chaco Z sandal can be repaired. The other product that Chaco produces is not repairable. And there are various reasons for it, but it starts with the fundamental design and construction of the item. It needs to be able to be undone. There is a fair amount of circularity that does go on. It may not come back in the same form you know it, but as I mentioned, you may have a pair of a sweatshirt that's a wool sweatshirt that winds up as the insulation in your home or in your automobile, seat or something like that.
Great. I wanted to next turn our conversation to talking about ethical leadership. And for this conversation, we'll define ethical leadership as leadership that is directed by respect for ethical beliefs and values and for the dignity and rights of others. Chip, you've been described as having a demonstrated track record of leading high-performing teams to create deep consumer connections while also driving profitable growth. Can you talk to us about how ethical leadership can lead to high-performing teams, deep consumer connections, and profitable growth?
Sure. Yeah. So I'd say in the first instance, to practice ethical leadership, you have to lead. I mean, that seems obvious, but leadership is a tricky thing for those of you, and maybe all of you, not quite all of you, who are still in school. The hardest thing to hire in the business world is leadership. You can hire accounting expertise, you can hire marketing wizardry, you can hire IT gurus that can deal with Excel spreadsheets the size of Alaska. You can hire all that stuff. But leadership is really elusive, and there are a bunch of really smart people who are really good at a lot of things that are just horrible leaders. So, causing somebody to act in a way that you want them to act is leadership. And so when we talk about ethical leadership, first of all, you've got to lead. And that's much broader than sort of, probably a derogatory term, but complaining or objecting is not leadership. Your voice is being heard, but you're generally speaking not leading. So I would say the first step in ethical leadership is action-based, it's thoughtful action, and that's the key. We had a number of instances at Smartwool in the early days for me that were, I think, pivotal and monumental. One was the commitment to gender balance within the company, and not just at the whole company level, but at the leadership level. So when we sold Smartwool to Timberland, and I stayed around for about a year and then retired from that gig, I think of my 6 direct reports, the vice presidential level, 4 of them were women, and the only guy was the CFO. All the marketing, sales, product, demand planning were all headed by women at the time. And so that engendered a kind of a loyalty from a very high performing group of employees. I was by far the oldest of those employees at the time. Most of them, almost all, started with a 2 or a 3 in their age, and they appreciated that we were kind of doing as we said we would. So I think ethical leadership starts with high integrity, real kind of purpose and value-driven action that is consistent and that is legit, authentic. We had a real strong commitment to the outdoors, and so we gave money for access purposes. We gave time for employees to volunteer. In those areas, we supported a number of causes and allowed employees to support those causes. And so as you start to align your values and your ethics with those of your team, you engender incredible loyalty and passion. And with that comes amazing performance. So the commitment to the brand and the cause, the commitment to the team, really, I think, amps up the performance in a huge way. And that leads to the results, the profitability, which in turn creates the opportunity to reinvest. If you don't have profits, unless you're a startup and you've got seed capital that just keeps coming, You've got to be profitable to be able to drive the machine. So I think employees, consumers, observers in the outdoor industry, the industry itself can relate to principled leadership, and there's the old saying, stand for something or fall for anything. And increasingly in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen outdoor companies really stand for that. Again, the poster child has long been Patagonia. There are some reasons for that. Patagonia is privately held. Yvonne and Melinda Chenard, who are the founders of the company, still own the company. Ironically, Yvonne couldn't care less about money. On paper, he's probably a billionaire. In real life, he's still a dirtbag. He just wants to fly, fish, surf, and climb, even though he's in his 70s. And so, they're a privately held company. They don't need to answer to anybody, and their owners don't care about money. So I guess it's kind of fun if you work there. But they're doing amazing things, and they've been a big advocate of taking stands. Interestingly, just in the last election cycle, they actually started taking political stands, which really most companies, if not all companies, have avoided to that point. So, I think that the industry is changing, and consumers expect leaders and brands to stand for something. You're not going to please everybody, but those who align with your values and you act with integrity, they're going to follow you. So, I think the ethical leadership part is you need to truly believe it and live it on a consistent basis. Even one letdown, even one sellout is going to be a major setback for you.
Great, thanks. I like how you talk about the values being shared, you embodying your employees' values, and them also looking up to you. I think that's ethical leadership isn't usually spoken about that way, so I really appreciated that insight. From the audience, we have a question on ethical leadership. The question is, how is Cat Footwear approaching company culture and feelings of emotional and physical safety during this time? Has anything changed in the way you lead? Where's most of the materials research done? That sounds like maybe too many questions. Maybe just focus on the ethical leadership part.
Yeah. So, boy, everything has changed. So I'm actually in my office, and I'm the only one that is in this office. And so when the lockdown came, obviously we locked down like everyone else did. Michigan, the place where we're based, although we have offices, kind of around the world a bit, where we're based in Michigan was one of the more aggressive. With our Governor Whitmer was pretty aggressive in locking things down. And so our employees, we were ahead of the curve as a company. We had employees work from home starting immediately. We spent a significant amount of money enabling our employees to work from home. We have on-site daycare. We have on-site doggy daycare. Both those had to shut down because we had to just allow people to kind of stay where they were. It's been a long time, and we've had 2 or 3 restart dates, and we have not restarted. So the so-called senior leadership team, of which I'm a member, is allowed to come into the office. Our employees are not, without special permission from the HR team. So outside of my office here, every one of our conference rooms has a huge, we call nutrition label on it for the number of people that are allowed in that conference room. Normally it might have been, say, 12, now it's 2 or 3, so we can practice social distancing. Every day before we come in, we have to fill out a form. We've taken our temperature. Here's what it registered. We don't have any symptoms. So we're doing all of that. And we're just supporting our employees to make sure that they're feeling safe. So we have surveys going all the time. We look at it every week. How are people feeling about coming back? We've proven that we can work remotely. Our CEO, to be honest, is not the biggest fan of remote work. He's doing a great job of supporting it, but if he had his choice, I think he'd rather see us back in the office. But we can't do so until the team feels safe. Compounding that, we've got a ton of employees who have school-age children, and that's a whole nother mess. So I don't know how it is in Colorado or in Boulder specifically, but in Michigan, the school districts are kind of all over the place. Some are doing 100% virtual, some are 100% in person, at least to start. Some are 2 days on, 2 days off because they split the alphabet. And so you got parents with kids, and it's really challenging. So the short answer to that long answer is everything has changed. We will not go back to the way things were until we can safely do so and our employees feel like they can safely do so. And then, of course, it's left up to each team leader. And for me, I lead the brand. I lived in Boulder after I was in Steamboat. I lived in Boulder for 4 or 5 years and ran Chaco, which was based here, before I took an assignment over in London with our company. And I just traveled in, every other week. At an office down, at 14th and Pearl, basically, with a couple of other employees that worked there. And I would be here when I needed to be. But generally speaking, we worked from Boulder. My attitude is just get your work done. And I think that's shared by most of the leaders in the company. If you're getting your work done, it doesn't matter. I can give you 2 near to my heart examples. So I have twin boys who came through the business school as well, graduated in 2012. One of them lives in New York City, or lived in New York City, works for Snapchat. And his longtime girlfriend, who's also a CU grad, works for Michael Bloomberg's foundation. And they are both work from home for so long that they sublet their apartment in New York City and last weekend moved to Telluride. And so they're living in Telluride for the next 6 months, still working for Snapchat, still working for Bloomberg Foundation, but just doing it remotely. His twin brother and his fiance, they get married on Friday, so 2 days from now. They both live in Denver, and they just moved up to Edwards because they also are working remotely and they can do their jobs from up there. They're actually ironically down in Telluride because they're getting married down there on Friday, so the whole family is down there. But that's just the way of the world. If you get your work done, I don't think people really care so much where you are. And until it's safe to come back, people aren't going to come back.
Thanks so much, Chip. We have just a few minutes left, but I wanted to end with one last question. Could you share one piece of advice with lead students who are aspiring to be strong, ethical leaders?
Yeah, let me say this to start out. I mean, work really hard to create credibility. There are so many smart people in the world, I'm telling you. Intelligence is really useful, but it's not what's going to distinguish you from anybody else. Credibility, integrity is the key element to me. If you want to be a leader, that means you need to be able to convince people to do things that you want them to do. And you're not going to be able to do that if you don't have credibility. So the first thing is to work hard to establish consistency and credibility as a team member, as a team leader, and then ultimately as a leader of a broader organization. And then secondly, once you're in that position, realize that it's a balance. You really need to balance your goals and your desires and your sense of urgency with patience. Things just take longer than you think they should in a lot of instances. And in order to maintain your credibility and keep the positivity on the team, you have to be able to temper the frustration that you will experience that things aren't happening as quickly as you'd like them to, and realize that you got to play the long game. It's not getting one thing done at the cost of torching a relationship or acting in a way that is inconsistent with the principles that you're trying to establish. You're playing for the long game. Hopefully you're in it for more than just one quick thing. So I would say work hard to put yourself in a position where people are willing to listen to you. And once you're there, balance your sense of urgency with patience to try and get things done. There's a great quote that I really liked. It came from a very unlikely source, a guy named Ralph Nader, who some of you may have heard of. He was one of the original consumer advocates way back in the 60s or something. The quote was as follows. He said, "The job of a leader is to create more leaders, not more followers." And I think that's always been super interesting to me. You guys may know I'm involved in the PMP program through Leads way back in the day. My wife and I made a contribution, and I served as a mentor before I got reassigned to London. And that's super rewarding. So as a leader, remember that your job is to create more leaders, not to create more followers.
I love that. I actually hadn't heard that quote before. Thank you for sharing all of that. I'm going to pass it back to Sarah since we are about at time.
Thank you so much, Chip and Natalie. That was so interesting. I learned so much. A few quick housekeeping items. CESR has many exciting events coming up focused on sustainable and social responsible business, including part 2 of a 3-part series with Schneider Electric and NREL on renewable energy. You can find out more information about our events on our website. CESR has also launched a new program called CESR Explores, where students can receive prizes like memberships to Naturally Boulder, books on sustainable business, and even lunch with a CEO, all for attending CESR or CESR affiliated events. And this event counts, so you're already have one for your tally. All the information I just talked about is going to be sent to you in an email from me, along with a feedback survey. Please take the time to let us know what you thought of today's event. It helps us out a lot. Lastly, I encourage you all to stay just a few more minutes. We have a guest from New Era, Colorado, Sydney. She's going to help us learn how to register to vote. All right, thank you so much to Natalie and Chip. If you have any questions you didn't get to ask, I invite you to send them to me and I'll pass them along. Okay, we hope to see you all online soon for our next event, and stick around for the voter registration.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
All right. Hi, my name is Ellie. I'm actually going to be leading the presentation from New Era. So yeah, hopefully some folks stick around. We're really excited to be here. I'm going to start by just sharing my screen. All right. Can everyone see that? I think it's still loading maybe.
It's loading, but we see it.
Okay, awesome. Wonderful. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you all for being here. We just want to start today by acknowledging the recent news about the lack of justice for Breonna Taylor, and everyone here is probably processing that differently. But yeah, we just want to thank you again for having us here. We know that voting is only one piece of our democracy, but it is one of the ways we can have a direct impact, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So just want to preface today's presentation with that. Yeah, and so before we get started, you'll need to have your Colorado ID, driver's license, or permit on hand. We're going to go through how to register to vote in Colorado or update your registration if you already are registered. Or you can use your social security number, but we'll explain more on how to use that later. And then throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, we have a lot of folks from New Era here who are going to be helping in the chat. So feel free to pop them in there. They'll either change their name to say that they're from New Era, or they can introduce themselves in the chat now if they'd like. Yeah, and then if you have a question you want to keep private, feel free to privately message in the chat or write it down, and we'll let you know of an email address at the end of the presentation that you can send any lingering questions to. But yeah, I just want to introduce myself and say thank you again for having us. My name's Ellie. I'm an organizer at New Era, Colorado. Like I said, we're here to get you registered to vote virtually. New Era is a nonpartisan, nonprofit voter registration drive and an advocacy group. We work to engage young people in democracy through voter turnout, and we work on uplifting important issues that face our generation in particular. So yeah, we're actually gonna just go ahead and get started, I think. So before we get into like the nitty gritty of registering, just want to talk about the importance of voter registration and turnout this year. Colorado has laws that make voter registration really accessible, and voting itself very accessible, which is great. And so once you're registered in Colorado, you'll get a ballot sent directly to you. And this makes it easier than ever to vote, which is super important this year, given the circumstances of COVID-19. Getting a ballot in the mail means that you can keep yourself safe and our community safe while still participating in democracy, which is great. All right, so let's quickly go over who's eligible to register to vote. Basically, you just need to be a US citizen. Anyone over 16 years old is also able to register. If you aren't voting age yet, you'll be considered a pre-registrant. You can also register even if you just moved here today. There's no requirement for like residency in Colorado. And then living in Colorado, Colorado also allows you to register and vote even if you have a history with the criminal justice system or past convictions, as long as you aren't currently serving time for a felony. So yeah, like I've mentioned, to register today, you'll just need to have either a Colorado State driver's license, permit, or ID, or your social security number. And then in terms of who can actually vote this November, you just have to be at least 18 and live in Colorado for 22 days prior to the election, which isn't until November 3rd, so everyone should be good to go. Cool, and then a few more things to know. If you live in Colorado, go to school here, or just consider the state your home, you can vote here. A lot of people think they have to keep voting wherever they moved from before school started, but that's actually not the case. So if you're currently registered in another state, you don't have to cancel that registration. You can just start voting in Colorado and stop voting in the former state. And we just want to note as well that if you aren't eligible to register today, that's completely fine. If you're interested in getting involved with our organization in other ways, or just becoming engaged in democracy outside of voting, or have questions about where to find resources for other opportunities, we will put our volunteer coordinator's email in the chat. Her name's Olivia. She's really great, and she'd love to get you all plugged in with other opportunities. Okay, and then last thing before we get into actually registering, just want to talk about why it's important to register to vote. We know that voting can seem intimidating, but you don't have to be an expert on politics to register. Google is super useful in this situation, and there are tons of resources at this time to help you better understand what's on the ballot. And one of the great things about getting a mail-in ballot is that you actually have the time to sit down and figure out, your stance on different issues, or answer any questions that you might have before you actually vote. We also want to point out that voting is a way to have your voice heard, like I said at the beginning. A lot of people feel disheartened by our political system and think that their vote might not matter, but this actually isn't the case at all. Millennials and Gen Z voters, that's voters who are under 35 years old, actually make up the largest demographic of people in our population, so we really do have the power to make or break an election if we vote. Yeah, and then just last thing, I want to note that voting isn't the only thing that we can do to be involved in democracy, but it is one of the most powerful tools that we have available to us, so we want to make sure that we take advantage of that. And even if certain candidates don't strike your fancy, you can always hop down the ballot, vote on certain ballot initiatives that affect you and your community on a more local level. Okay, so now we're actually going to get into registering online. Just want to make sure that you have everything you need. If you're registering for the first time, you'll just need a Colorado ID, driver's license, or permit if you've been issued one, or you can use your social security number, which I'll touch on in a moment. And if you're updating your registration, you can actually use either your ID number or your social security number. Cool, so this is basically what I just said without the slide in front of us. But yeah, hopefully that's pretty clear. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'm also going to go over it a few times as we move along. And if you've never been issued a Colorado ID, don't worry. Like I said, you'll use your social security number. The online portal, which we'll get to, will direct you to print out and mail in a voter registration form to the Secretary of State. So it looks like a slightly different process, but it should be really simple. Cool. And then if you do have a Colorado ID, this is what it should look like. You'll just need your Colorado ID number to register. You don't even need the card in front of you. So this slide just shows you where on your ID card you should be able to find that number. It's in the section called 4D, which is the customer identifier. Okay, awesome. So now we're actually going to register. If everyone that's here who either has registered but wants to update or check, or is a first-time registrant, wouldn't mind following along, that'd be great. We're just going to go to registerincolorado.org. And once you get there, your page should look like this. On the right, you'll have an option to update an existing record. Just choose this if you're updating, or if you just want to check and see if you have all your info correct. And then you'll also see an option for getting registered for the first time. And then, yeah, choose the option on the left. I'll move along so you can see what it looks like. If you're updating or just want to look it up, and then you'll just go ahead and fill out that form with all of your info. Basically, this is just your name, full legal name, birthday, phone number, email, and address. And then if you've never been issued a Colorado ID, you'll click on that option. Because folks who are registering for the first time in Colorado without an ID need to print and return this form. Like I've mentioned, your page will look a little bit different, but once you put in your name and email, it'll prompt you to print out that form or save it and print it later, so you can do that at your own discretion. Okay, cool. So hopefully everyone has made it to the website. If not, just let us know in the chat and we're happy to help. Basically, I'm just going to help walk you through the different steps of registering. They're pretty simple, but we want to make sure that all the info is accurate, everything's clear so that we don't have any hiccups as you register. So on this first step, you're just going to put in your full legal name. If you have a suffix, that's like a junior, a senior, or a Roman numeral at the end of your name, you'll want to include that too. And then we will move along to the next slide. Okay, cool. So if you scroll down, you'll see you'll need to put in your birthday and your ID number. Like I've said quite a few times now, if you're registering for the first time, it has to be your ID number that you use if you have been issued a Colorado ID. And then folks who are updating can choose to use their social security number, just the last 4 digits, or their ID number, whichever is easiest for you. And then you'll just want to verify that you're not a robot. Okay. Cool, so hopefully everyone's made it through that. This step basically just verifies that you are eligible to vote in Colorado. Basically, it'll ask if you're a US citizen, 16 years of age or older. And then the last question is just asking, like I've said, if you've lived in Colorado for at least 22 days prior to an election. Yeah, so don't stress over this question. Like I've said, you can get registered regardless of how long you've lived in Colorado. Basically, this just is concerning how long you've been here before an election, but we're all good to go on that since it's not till November. Okay, awesome. So this next slide is asking for a party affiliation, or this next step. Basically, this is completely up to your own discretion. You can change your party affiliation at any time. You can also stay unaffiliated. It's definitely not a lifelong commitment. And then in Colorado also, what's really great is if you choose to be unaffiliated, you can still vote in the primary elections. So you'll have an option to select which primaries you'd like to vote in. And then there are just a couple questions about military service, and then you'll want to put your email in. It's not public, but this is really helpful in case there are any issues. The county clerk can reach out to you and get them resolved. Okay, cool. So hopefully we're not going too fast. Let me know if I need to slow down or speed up. Basically, this next part of this step just wants you to put in your phone number. Again, this is important in case there are any issues, then the county clerk can contact you really easily. You don't have to go in person, which is ideal at this time. Yeah, so you'll just want to fill that out. It asks about a gender identifier. If you'd like to put one, no pressure to, of course. And then you'll want to put in your residential address. And as you can see, it says no PO boxes. This is just because this specific spot on the registration application is to show that you do have a residence in Colorado, so it has to be a Colorado address. Basically, if you don't have a permanent address, don't worry. You can use a friend's address or the address of a church or another community space. Basically, wherever you consider home in Colorado and where you return to regularly. And if you don't know your county or your zip code, don't worry, ask us in the chat. We'd love to help you with that. All right, and then this next section is where you can actually fill in where you want your ballot to be delivered to. So if your mailing address is the same as your residential address above, you can just leave this section blank and move along. But if you want to receive your ballot at a different address, or if it's a PO box or something like that, an absentee address within Colorado or another state, anything like that, you'll want to fill that in here. Basically, you can update the address to mail your ballot anytime online. You want to make sure you do it whenever you move or you have a new spot that you'd like your ballot to get sent to. Obviously, folks have been moving a lot with COVID-19, so we just want to make sure that folks are really staying on top of this to make sure that they get their ballot delivered to the right spot. All right, and then this last step is really important, seems really straightforward, but like I said, this is a really important document. We want to make sure everything looks accurate. So just take a moment, look over it, make sure everything looks good, and then we can move on. All right, so kind of in the same vein, this last step just wants you to affirm that all the info that you put in during your application is accurate and looks how you want it to look. Basically, you can read these really long sentences if you'd like to, but like I said, it's just confirming that everything's accurate. So feel free to go ahead and click the checkbox on both of those and then go ahead and click submit. And then once you've submitted, you should see a confirmation page that your application's been received. This is great news. You've made it to the finish line. Basically, you can just check this out now, or you can download a PDF copy of your confirmation just to have on record to make sure that you know everything looks good and you have that in case there are any hiccups, but we don't anticipate any if you followed along with us. Yeah, so we just want to thank you all again for having us and congratulate you on registering or updating or just checking it if that's all you did. And want to point out again that, you know, this November is one of the most important elections of our lifetimes, and we really need all hands on deck to make sure that young people are heard this fall. So we would love if you would volunteer with us to register young folks and get out the vote. We have in-person and at-home opportunities depending on what you're most comfortable with. So our digital organizing includes all the stuff listed here: phone banking, texting, giving presentations, trainings, all that kind of good stuff, pretty much anything that strikes your fancy. And then we also have field organizing, which includes tabling, which we've been doing quite a bit of lately, basically registering folks in classes, and then other less person-to-person stuff that you can still do outdoors, which is super fun. But yeah, thank you so much. Oh, I forgot to mention, this is Olivia's email and also our website if you want to get involved in volunteering. Hopefully we've put her email in the chat as well, but she would love to connect with all of you. Yeah, thank you so much for having us here today, tagging us on at the end of this. This is a different email, definitely use Olivia's. And yeah, just remember to vote on November 3rd, and don't hesitate to contact us with any questions that you might have in the meantime. And thank you all for being voters. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen if I can.
Thank you so much, Ellie, and everyone from New Era. I actually just learned so much, so I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see y'all soon.